She had heard the jokes since the very first day of basic training, the whispers behind her back, the smirks when she lagged a few seconds behind the rest of the platoon during long runs, the mocking comments about how she didn't belong there because she wasn't built like the others, because she wasn't as tall, because her frame looked smaller, because she had once stumbled while carrying a loaded pack on the training field, and though she pushed herself harder every day, the label had already stuck. The weak one, the one who stops, the one who can't keep up. And soldiers could be ruthless when they sensed a weakness in their ranks, turning teasing into an unspoken ritual that followed her from drill to drill, until even she began to wonder if maybe they were right, but deep inside she clung to a burning determination that they couldn't see, a fire that had carried her through countless lonely nights when she told herself that strength wasn't only measured in speed or size but in how far you would go for the person next to you, and that conviction was about to be tested in a way none of them could ever imagine. It happened on a training march through rough terrain, the kind of exercise designed to break down endurance and reveal who could really carry the weight of combat. The sun was merciless, baking the dusty path until it shimmered with heat, sweat soaked through their uniforms, packs bit into their shoulders, and breath came in sharp, ragged pulls, and though the squad kept their formation, she could feel their eyes darting back to her as if waiting for her to falter, as if expecting her to stumble again, and each step felt heavier under the weight of that expectation. But she locked her jaw and told herself she wouldn't give them the satisfaction, not this time. The sergeant leading them, a massive man pushing 200 pounds of solid muscle, barked orders with his usual unrelenting tone, keeping everyone in line, reminding them that war would not wait for weakness, that survival was about carrying on no matter how much the body screamed to stop, and even as exhaustion gnawed at her limbs she focused on his voice, because in its harshness there was also a strange kind of reassurance, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that every one of them was being tested. But then it happened in a way that no one had expected. The sergeant's voice suddenly broke off, cut short by a strangled grunt, and his massive frame lurched before crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust, and for a heartbeat the entire squad froze in disbelief, because this was the man who seemed untouchable, the iron pillar of their unit, now lying still with his face pale and sweat-soaked, his breaths shallow and labored as if every ounce of his strength had been ripped away. Chaos erupted. Some shouted for help, others cursed, the line broke as men argued about what to do, and in the confusion the truth hit all of them. The nearest outpost with medics was 3 miles back the way they had come, and unless someone carried him there he would not make it, but no one moved, because the idea of hauling 200 pounds of dead weight across that grueling distance under the punishing heat seemed impossible. Each soldier hesitated, their bravado shriveling under the sheer magnitude of the task, and for a moment the air was thick with fear and paralysis. She didn't think, she didn't weigh the odds, she simply acted, because deep inside something fierce surged to the surface, that fire she had been carrying all along, the defiance against every mocking word and every doubting glance, and before anyone else could react she dropped her own pack, crouched beside the fallen sergeant, and with a grunt that tore through her chest she heaved his massive weight across her shoulders, staggering under the initial shock of it, her knees buckling as pain shot down her back, but she dug her boots into the dirt and forced herself upright, ignoring the gasps around her, ignoring the voices shouting that she couldn't possibly do it, because at that moment there was no room for doubt, only the certainty that if she didn't move he would die. Every step was agony, her body screaming with the effort, her lungs burning, her muscles trembling under the crushing burden, but she leaned into the rhythm, one step, then another, the sergeant's weight pressing down like a mountain, yet somehow fueling her as well, because with each stride she proved the voices wrong, she proved the laughter hollow. She proved that stopping didn't mean quitting but gathering the strength to keep going when it mattered most, and though the 3 miles stretched before her like an endless punishment, she set her jaw and marched forward, each footfall echoing louder than any insult ever thrown her way, because she wasn't carrying just a man, she was carrying the truth of who she really was. The first mile was the worst because it was not only her muscles that rebelled but also the sneering voices of her comrades that echoed inside her head, as though every cruel remark had been stitched into her bones, dragging her down heavier than the sergeant himself, and as she staggered forward she could feel her thighs quivering, her shoulders screaming beneath the strain, her vision swimming in the glare of the sun, but she refused to yield, she kept her focus narrowed to the ground in front of her, to the next step and then the next, telling herself that if she could make it just one more yard then she could make another, and soon the distance behind her began to stretch, leaving the stunned faces of her platoon farther and farther back until their disbelief turned into a silent escort as they followed her in awed silence, no one daring to step ahead, no one daring to laugh now. Dust rose with each trudging step, sticking to her sweat-drenched skin, her mouth dry as sand, her breath tearing raggedly from her chest like fire, but she clung to the rhythm of survival, the cadence of necessity, because giving in was not an option when a life pressed across her shoulders, and though the sergeant was unconscious, she could feel the faint stir of his breathing against her back, a fragile reminder that he was still alive, that each step she forced herself to take mattered, and that kept her from breaking. She thought of the times she had faltered during training, the looks of exasperation from drill instructors, the smirks of the stronger recruits, the muttered jokes that she would never last in the real crucible of battle, and every memory that once felt like shame now transformed into fuel, pushing her forward, because here, in this raw test of body and will, no one else had stepped up, no one else had risked collapsing beneath the weight. It was her alone, the so-called weakest link, carrying the backbone of their unit. Her boots slammed against the dirt with stubborn defiance, the terrain rough and uneven, rocks threatening to twist her ankles, inclines clawing at her calves, and with every new obstacle her body begged her to stop, to crumble under the impossible weight, but each time she gritted her teeth harder, snarled a curse under her breath, and drove herself onward, because she wasn't about to let the man who had pushed them all so hard die on her watch. Somewhere behind her she could hear voices, some shouting encouragement now, others still too stunned to believe their eyes, but she didn't dare glance back. She didn't want to see pity or shock or admiration. She wanted only to keep moving, to drown everything else out until the only sound left was the pounding of her heart and the crunch of her boots in the dirt. The second mile bled into the first in a haze of pain and determination, her shoulders raw beneath the crushing weight, her back ached as if knives were being driven into her spine, but her mind had shifted into a different place, a zone beyond ordinary endurance where thought narrowed into instinct, where the world shrank to the line of the path stretching ahead, and she became nothing but movement and resolve, step after step after step, dragging the sergeant's life back toward safety. At one point she stumbled, her knees slamming into the ground with a jolt that nearly sent them both tumbling, the air blasting from her lungs in a choking cry, and for an instant the temptation to stay there, to collapse in the dust and admit defeat, loomed dangerously close. But then she felt the faint rasp of breath against her neck again, reminding her that she wasn't carrying dead weight, she was carrying hope. She was carrying a man who had drilled courage into them day after day, and with a guttural roar she shoved herself upright again, her legs trembling like brittle wood yet somehow finding the strength to keep moving. Time became meaningless, the march a blur of agony and stubbornness, the sun crawling higher overhead like a merciless overseer, and though her lips cracked from thirst and her vision blurred with sweat, she refused to think about how much farther remained. She refused to measure the distance in miles, she measured it instead in breaths and heartbeats, in the simple victory of surviving the next step, because as long as she could take one more, she was not finished. And with every agonizing stride she felt something shift not only within herself but in the air around her, the atmosphere of her platoon changing from doubt to something else, something heavier than silence, a dawning recognition that they were witnessing a kind of courage that drills could not teach, a ferocity of spirit that outweighed any muscle, and though none of them spoke it aloud yet, she could feel their eyes on her, not mocking now, not dismissing, but following as if she were the one leading them. And so the miles bled together, the pain growing sharper, her body breaking down piece by piece, but her will only hardening, because she knew she had already crossed the point of no return. She could not stop, she would not stop, not until she laid the sergeant down in the hands of medics, not until she had silenced forever the chorus of doubt that had followed her since the first day she put on the uniform. The third mile loomed ahead like an endless wall, and though every nerve in her body was screaming at her to quit, she clung to the weight on her shoulders as if letting go would mean the end of everything she had fought for, the sergeant's heavy form pressing her down until her spine felt like it might snap, yet somehow also keeping her upright because the responsibility was too sacred to abandon. And as she trudged forward she could hear the uneven scuffle of boots behind her where the others followed, still stunned, still silent, their earlier mockery now replaced by a heavy awe that they didn't know how to express, and she thought fleetingly of how different this march had become from every other one before, because she was no longer the straggler trying desperately not to fall behind, she was the center, the one all eyes followed, and though she felt no pride in that moment, only agony and determination, it was enough to ignite a deeper strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her throat was parched to the point of rawness, each breath scraping her chest like broken glass, sweat poured down her face and stung her eyes until the world blurred, but she shook her head fiercely and kept going, one unsteady step after another, her boots dragging through dust and gravel, her knees wobbling dangerously, her arms numb from gripping the limp weight of the man she carried, yet still her mind screamed louder than her body, urging her not to give up because she was so close now, So close to proving not just to them but to herself that she was more than the weak one, more than the girl who always stopped. She could almost picture the outpost ahead, the low building with its medical flag, the blessed shade that would mean the end of this hell, and in her mind she saw herself laying the sergeant down alive, handing him to the medics, and hearing him breathe again without struggle, and that vision burned so bright inside her that it dragged her onward even when her legs buckled and her body threatened to collapse. The path grew crueler as though mocking her, inclines rising like hills that tore at her calves, loose stones sliding beneath her boots, and with each slip she risked falling for good, but she gritted her teeth and pushed harder, letting out animal grunts that ripped from her throat raw and furious, and every sound was a defiance against weakness, against doubt, against every laugh that had ever cut her down. She remembered one recruit's smirk when she once paused to catch her breath during training, his mocking drawl, "You'll never last in the field if you keep stopping," and the memory stabbed her with fresh rage because here in this brutal test none of those mocking voices had stepped forward, not one of them had dared take the burden from her, and the irony of it all fueled her until her steps hit the ground harder, as if each one was driving the memory of their doubt deeper into the dirt. She had long since lost track of time, her mind swimming in a haze of pain and adrenaline, but somewhere in the fog she realized that she had found a rhythm again, a brutal, punishing rhythm of survival, and it struck her that this was the truth about strength, that it wasn't about speed or endurance on paper, it wasn't about muscles or height, it was about the refusal to yield when the world bore down with everything it had, and by that measure she knew she was stronger than any of them had ever given her credit for. Behind her, the platoon had gone quiet in a way that felt almost reverent, and though she could not see their faces, she knew that their silence was no longer filled with disdain but with something that bordered on respect, even fear, because they were witnessing a kind of willpower that drills and ranks couldn't manufacture, something raw and undeniable, and while she had no energy to savor it, she felt it settle around her like a shield, keeping her upright through the last brutal stretch. Her body had reached the edge of collapse, her vision blackening at the edges, her breaths ragged and uneven, her arms trembling uncontrollably, but she told herself over and over that she would not stop now, not within sight of the end, and with a guttural roar that came from somewhere deep in her soul she surged forward with renewed fury, the weight across her shoulders somehow lighter for just an instant, as if the sergeant himself willed her onward, and step by agonizing step she closed the distance to safety, refusing to fall, refusing to fail, until the faint outline of the outpost finally shimmered in the distance like a mirage come real. The sight of the outpost in the distance struck her with a jolt of hope so sharp it almost hurt, because after miles of nothing but dust and agony that low cluster of buildings looked like a promise carved out of the earth itself, and though her body was on the brink of collapse she clung to that vision as if it were the only thing keeping her alive, her boots dragging furrows into the dirt as she forced one trembling step after another, the sergeant's weight still crushing her shoulders like an anvil but no longer suffocating her spirit, because she knew now with absolute certainty that she was going to make it, that no force on earth was strong enough to stop her before she delivered him to safety. Every muscle fiber in her body screamed rebellion, her back felt as though fire had been poured into her spine, her legs shook so violently she thought her bones might snap, and her breath came in ragged wheezes that tore at her throat, but she pressed forward with the stubbornness of someone who had already gone too far to turn back, telling herself that the pain was temporary but what she carried was a life, and that thought lashed her forward even when her vision blurred so badly the outpost seemed to waver like a mirage on the horizon. Behind her, the platoon had stopped jeering long ago, their earlier disbelief melted into something heavier, their boots crunching in unison as they followed her in silence, and though she couldn't spare the strength to look back, she could feel their eyes locked on her every movement, feel the weight of their astonishment pressing against her, and the knowledge that she had transformed in their sight from the weak one into something far fiercer only pushed her harder, because she knew that what she was doing would not be forgotten, not by them, not by anyone. The last half-mile felt like walking through fire, each step a battle against the collapse threatening to drag her into the dirt, her body screaming for mercy, but she clenched her jaw until her teeth ached and bellowed through the pain, a guttural sound that was half roar and half sob, and somehow that primal fury kept her upright, kept her moving, her boots hammering the earth with grim defiance until finally she reached the edge of the outpost grounds, the shouts of medics rushing toward her, cutting through the haze of pain like a lifeline. The moment she saw them sprinting forward, their red crosses glinting in the sun, the dam inside her finally cracked, and with one last staggering step she dropped to her knees, carefully sliding the unconscious sergeant from her shoulders into waiting hands, her chest heaving as she collapsed face first into the dirt, her body too spent to move another inch, but the roar of voices around her, the frantic commands of the medics, The gasps of the soldiers who had followed, all told her that she had done it, that she had carried him all 3 miles and saved his life, and that knowledge wrapped around her like a shield as the blackness of exhaustion swept her under. When she woke some hours later, it was to the sharp scent of antiseptic and the dim hum of generators, her body still aching from head to toe but her mind clear enough to recognize the infirmary walls of the outpost, and as her eyes flicked around she caught sight of the sergeant himself lying on the cot across from her, alive, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, color slowly returning to his rugged face, and the sight brought a wave of relief so powerful it brought tears to her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to show weakness even in that moment. Around her stood members of the platoon, men who had once mocked her every misstep, and now they stood silent and awkward, shifting on their feet as though unsure how to meet her gaze, their expressions a mixture of shame and respect, and though no one spoke at first, the silence was thicker than any words, until finally one of them, the same recruit who had once sneered at her for stopping, muttered in a low voice that carried through the room, "You carried him, all the way," and in that single sentence was all the awe, all the disbelief, all the reluctant admiration that none of them had the courage to admit outright. She didn't reply because words felt unnecessary, and instead she simply nodded once, her face calm though inside her chest her heart swelled with the knowledge that she had proven them wrong not with arguments but with action, that she had shown them strength was not about who mocked the loudest or who ran the fastest, but about who kept moving when no one else would, and though she knew the grueling days of training ahead would not grow easier, she also knew that she would never be dismissed as the weak one again, because she had carried the weight none of them dared to shoulder, and in doing so she had carried herself into a place they would never forget. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of soreness and silence, her body aching with every tiny movement, but beneath the pain there was a steady pulse of pride she had never felt before, not the boastful kind but the quiet certainty that she had crossed a line no one could push her back from, and as she lay in the infirmary, she caught pieces of the medics' conversations, how the sergeant had suffered a sudden collapse from dehydration and heat exhaustion, how if she had delayed even 10 minutes he might not have survived, and hearing those words brought a weight of realization crashing over her. She had not only carried him, she had saved his life. The sergeant remained unconscious for most of that night, but when dawn broke, she stirred awake to the sound of a deep, raspy chuckle across the room, and when she turned her head she saw him propped against a pillow, pale but alive, his eyes sharp even in weakness, fixed on her with something between disbelief and respect, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken acknowledgement, until at last his voice, rough as gravel, cut through the room. "You carried me." She swallowed hard, not knowing what to say because the weight of those words from a man like him was more than any metal, and she simply nodded, her throat too tight to answer, but he gave a slow, approving smile that carried more power than any order he had ever barked on the field. The rest of the platoon drifted in and out during that day, some lingering awkwardly near her cot, others muttering quiet words they never would have dared say before, and though no one outright apologized for the months of jeers and jokes, she could feel the shift in the air, the way their eyes met hers differently now, no longer filled with doubt but with an unfamiliar respect, and even those who had once mocked her most seemed unsure of themselves, as if they could no longer place her in the box they had built around her. She thought back to the countless times she had paused in training, the moments that had branded her as weak in their eyes, and now she understood what they had never bothered to see, that stopping had not been giving up but gathering strength, conserving herself for when it truly mattered, and the irony of it burned in her chest like fire, because she had carried farther and harder than any of them ever had when the moment demanded it. As the days passed and her body healed, the story of what she had done spread through the base like wildfire, whispered first in stunned tones, then retold with awe, until even soldiers from other units came to steal glances at the woman who had carried a 200-pound sergeant 3 miles under the burning sun, and though the attention made her uncomfortable, she bore it quietly, knowing that she had earned every word of it through blood and grit. The sergeant himself recovered steadily, and though he returned quickly to his gruff and commanding nature, there was a subtle change in how he looked at her, a flicker of recognition in his eyes when their gazes met, and once as they stood together at the edge of the training field, he leaned slightly closer and muttered low enough for only her to hear, "Strength isn't about never stopping, it's about refusing to stay down," and she realized then that he understood her in a way no one else had, that he had seen the truth she carried even before she proved it to the others. Her fellow recruits began to seek her out differently now, some asking for advice on endurance, others offering small gestures of camaraderie they had never shown before, and while she accepted it all with quiet grace, she never forgot the sting of their earlier mockery, never forgot how quickly they had dismissed her, and it fueled her even more to continue proving them wrong, not with words but with action. She threw herself back into training with renewed intensity, her every run, her every drill, her every march marked by a determination sharper than ever, because now she knew she was capable of more than even she had imagined, and that knowledge was a weapon no one could take from her. The memory of the sergeant's weight across her shoulders stayed with her like a brand, not as a burden but as a reminder of the strength she had unlocked, and whenever fatigue crept in during the long days, she called upon that memory and felt fire roar through her veins again. She understood now that she had not only carried him to safety but had carried herself into a new identity, one forged not by the judgments of others but by the unyielding truth of what she had done, and as she looked at the faces of those around her, some still hesitant, some openly respectful, she knew that from that day forward she would never again be underestimated, never again be dismissed as weak, because she had proven on the harshest ground that when it mattered most she was the one who would rise and carry the weight no one else dared to lift. In the weeks that followed, her life within the platoon shifted in ways she had never expected, because though the routines of training remained grueling, the endless runs, the push-ups, the field exercises, the long marches under blistering sun and biting cold, she was no longer the one everyone waited on, no longer the soldier they expected to stumble or quit, and instead she found eyes turning toward her almost unconsciously, watching how she pushed herself, watching how she never complained, and though no one said it outright, she could feel that some had begun to measure their own endurance against hers, as though she had become a silent standard none of them had asked for but all of them respected. It felt strange at first to carry that kind of invisible weight, to realize that her every step was no longer her own but carried the echo of others' expectations, yet she didn't shrink from it, she embraced it, because she knew that true strength wasn't just about surviving herself but about inspiring those beside her to survive as well. She noticed small changes in the way they treated her, how during marches some fell in step beside her rather than rushing ahead, how during drills a few of the louder ones no longer made cutting remarks but instead offered brief nods of approval, and even though none of them would admit it, she understood that they were beginning to see her not just as another recruit but as someone they could trust to keep moving when things grew impossible. The sergeant, now fully recovered, tested her harder than ever, barking her name during runs, driving her through obstacle courses with relentless commands, yet beneath his gravelly tone there was an edge of something different, something almost like respect hidden under the guise of discipline. And once, after she had completed a near-impossible endurance drill that left half the unit sprawled in the dirt gasping, he paused as she stood panting and covered in sweat, then gave her the smallest of nods before turning away, and that single gesture meant more to her than any shouted praise could have. The whispers about her feat spread beyond their own unit, reaching others across the base, and soon strangers approached her with curious glances, some asking if the story was true, others staring at her as if she had stepped out of some legend, and though the attention unsettled her, she bore it with quiet dignity, never embellishing what she had done, always answering simply that she had carried him because no one else had, because it needed to be done, and those words, plain as they were, seemed to strike deeper than any boastful tale could. As her reputation grew, so did the weight of responsibility, and she began to realize that her actions had made her something more than just another recruit in training. She had become an example, and whether she wanted it or not, the others now looked at her differently, waiting to see if she would stumble again, waiting to see if she could live up to the standard she had set in that brutal march, and she resolved that she would, not for their approval, not for their respect, but because she had discovered in herself a strength too precious to abandon. She drove herself harder with each passing day, running until her lungs burned, carrying packs heavier than regulation required, repeating obstacle courses until her hands bled, not out of obsession but out of the quiet conviction that if the moment came again, if someone else's life hung in the balance, she would be ready, stronger than before, and never caught by surprise. What surprised her most, though, was how her transformation began to ripple through the platoon itself, how those who had once mocked her began to push themselves harder too, how the laughter that once rang at her expense was replaced by a gritted determination to match her, and slowly the dynamic of the group shifted, the competitiveness tempered by a new undercurrent of unity, because they had seen what real strength looked like, and it had humbled them. Some nights she lay awake in her bunk, staring at the dim ceiling, her body aching but her heart strangely full, and she wondered if this was how leaders were born, not through ambition or loud commands, but through the raw example of action when everything was on the line, and though she never sought that role, she found herself stepping into it naturally, offering a word of encouragement when someone faltered, sharing the quiet truths she had learned, that it was okay to pause, that stopping wasn't failure if it gave you the strength to rise again. And to her surprise those words resonated, sparking nods and thoughtful silence from soldiers who once wouldn't have given her a second glance. She carried the memory of the sergeant's weight every day, not as a burden but as a source of power, and though her body still bore the aches from that ordeal, her spirit carried no scars, only fire, and as training advanced toward harsher, more dangerous exercises that mimicked the chaos of real combat, she felt ready in a way she had never known before, ready not only for herself but for those beside her, because she understood now that strength was not a solitary thing but a bond forged in the act of carrying each other when no one else would. Life has a strange way of testing patience when a man is trying to make sense of a woman's hidden signals, and by this stage of the story, the man had already collected enough pieces of her behavior to know she was intentionally letting certain words slip, as if she wanted him to pick up on her interest, without making herself completely vulnerable. Yet in the 7th phase of her accidental confessions, the most powerful phrase she let out was simple but carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "I just feel safer when you're around." She said it not in the middle of a long conversation but casually, as if she hadn't realized what she had admitted, and it landed in his heart like an anchor that pulled all his doubts into clarity. For a woman to confess safety in the presence of a man, even in accidental words, is to reveal that her emotional defenses have already softened, that the fortress she built around her feelings had opened a small gate just for him. The moment those words reached his ears, he began replaying every little memory, how she leaned slightly closer when he spoke, how her laughter always carried an extra note of warmth, how she unconsciously adjusted her appearance when she knew he was near. Suddenly, all of it fit together like pieces of a puzzle he had been solving in the dark. But this phrase, this simple declaration of safety, was different from all the others. It was not about curiosity, attraction, or playful banter. It was about trust, the one thing no woman gives lightly and no man should ever take for granted. He thought about the countless times he had walked her home or stayed a little longer than necessary just to make sure she was comfortable. At first, he told himself it was politeness, the instinct of a man raised to respect and protect, but in truth he had been drawn to the invisible thread that connected them even when words were absent. Now, her slip of the tongue revealed that she noticed that she valued it, and more than that, she had come to depend on it. And that dependence was not weakness, it was a sign of strength, because admitting safety in someone's presence is to admit vulnerability, and only those who are ready for deeper bonds dare to admit it. He knew then that her feelings were no longer hidden beneath the surface but were beginning to emerge like light seeping through the cracks of a closed door. He also realized how dangerous this moment was, because one careless reaction from him could make her retreat back into silence. So he chose patience, to let her believe the words had slipped unnoticed, while secretly engraving them into his memory as proof that her heart was opening toward him. Over the following days he watched carefully, and he noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Whenever they sat together, she no longer crossed her arms defensively. Instead, she allowed her shoulders to relax, sometimes leaning closer than before. Her eyes met his more often, and when they did, there was no rush to look away, no nervous laughter to cover the silence. And when the world grew loud, when others surrounded them, she somehow always found her way back to stand near him, as if his presence shielded her from the chaos. He began to realize that what she said once was not an accident but a truth her heart had long been whispering, only now slipping out through her lips. And with every repetition of her closeness, the phrase, "I feel safer with you," echoed louder in his mind until it became a silent rhythm between them. He could see that she was waiting too, waiting for him to respond, waiting to know if the safety she felt was matched by a promise from him. One evening, when they were walking under the dim glow of the street lamps, she spoke again in that unguarded way that revealed more than she intended. They had been talking about the uncertainty of life, about how unpredictable each day could be, and she sighed softly before whispering, "At least when you're here, I don't feel so alone." That was it, the second time her heart betrayed her, offering another fragment of her truth. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear but with the overwhelming realization that her feelings were not just accidental slips anymore but a growing trust that demanded acknowledgement. And though he longed to reach out, to tell her that he too felt at home in her presence, he understood that timing was everything. To speak too soon might break the fragile rhythm they had built, to wait too long might let doubt creep into her heart. So he chose the middle path, small gestures, consistent presence, and silent promises carried in the way he looked at her, the way he never let her walk on the side of the road, the way he always made sure her comfort came before his own. And though she never said the words directly again, her actions confirmed what her accidental phrases had already confessed. She laughed more freely with him, she trusted him with little secrets she wouldn't share with others, and sometimes in the quiet moments when their eyes met and lingered, There was no need for language at all. He understood then that love is not always shouted from the rooftops but is often whispered through accidents, through small phrases that escape unnoticed but carry the weight of eternity. And in her confession of safety, he found not only her heart but also the unspoken responsibility to honor the trust she had placed in him. This was not the end of their story but the beginning of something deeper, something fragile yet powerful, like a flame that could light their future if nurtured with care. In the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, the weight of the journey and the emotions shared finally settled between them like a gentle mist that refused to fade away. The room was dimly lit, only a single lamp glowing softly in the corner, casting long shadows against the walls that seemed to breathe with every quiet heartbeat. She sat by the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the calm expression she tried to wear. He noticed immediately, his eyes drawn not to the stillness she tried to project but to the restless movements of her hands. Without a word, he reached out, gently taking her fingers into his, steadying them as if by holding her he could transfer his strength to her. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide, shimmering with emotions too layered to name, a mixture of relief, fear and something deeper, something she had been too cautious to admit aloud. For a long while they didn't speak. The silence between them felt sacred, filled with all the words they didn't dare to release. His thumb brushed softly over her knuckles, each stroke deliberate, grounding her, reminding her that despite everything they were still here, still together, still surviving. Finally, her lips parted, a whisper escaping like a fragile secret. "I don't know what I would have done without you." The words carried a tremble, not just of vulnerability but of truth, and they cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in silk. His chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to show the cracks in his armor. He leaned closer, his forehead brushing against hers, his voice low and raw. "You'll never have to find out because I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." The promise hung in the air between them and she closed her eyes, leaning into him as if surrendering to the comfort she had fought so hard to resist. The warmth of his presence surrounded her, pulling her out of the storm she had lived in for too long. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him everything she had bottled up, the fears she couldn't shake, the hope that scared her, the way her heart beat differently whenever he was near, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she let herself feel, let her guard fall just for him because with him it felt safe. He sensed it, the silent acceptance, and he pressed a soft kiss to her hair, lingering there, unwilling to let go. "We've been through too much to stop now," he whispered, more to himself than to her, but she heard it, and the faintest smile tugged at her lips. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grounding herself in the sound, in the reminder that he was real and here. The world outside could still be harsh and unforgiving, but in this moment it didn't matter. They had carved out a fragile sanctuary in each other and that was enough. His hands stayed wrapped around hers, their fingers intertwined tightly, as if daring the world to try and break them apart. Every second that passed deepened the unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged not in words but in shared trials and the quiet strength they found in one another. She tilted her face slightly, her voice barely above a breath. "Do you ever wonder if we were meant to find each other?" The question startled him, but only for a moment, because in truth he had wondered the same countless times. His answer was immediate, his tone carrying certainty that surprised even him. "I don't wonder. I know. No matter what path we took, I think it would have led us here." Her heart ached at the conviction in his words, but it wasn't the painful kind of ache. It was the kind that comes with recognizing something you've longed for and finally finding it. She squeezed his hand tighter, anchoring herself to him as the fear inside her slowly gave way to something softer, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in the fragile cocoon of their connection, speaking only when silence felt too heavy, but mostly letting the presence of the other say everything words couldn't. By the time the night stretched long and silence fully claimed the space, they had both realized something unshakable. They weren't just surviving anymore. They had found each other, and in that, they had found a reason to keep going, no matter what lay ahead. The end.